The first question was, when will the temple be destroyed? And what will be the sign that it's about to happen? You see, in their mind, if the temple was destroyed, that must have meant the end was near, but it really had nothing to do with the end. But it was still a major player because that's when the time of the Gentiles began. They're going to trample down the city until the time of the Gentiles is fulfilled. So, the first question was, when will the temple be destroyed and what will be the sign that is about to happen? Now, here's what's interesting. As I've already mentioned, Luke is the only gospel that records Jesus' answer to this question. Matthew and Mark don't mention it at all. So let's read verses 20 through 24 in Luke chapter 21. And when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then you will know that the time of its destruction has arrived. Then those in Judea must flee to the hills, those in Jerusalem must get out, and those out in the country should not return to the city. For those will be days of God's vengeance, and the prophetic words of the Scriptures will be fulfilled. How terrible it will be for pregnant women and for nursing mothers in those days. For there will be disaster in the land and great anger against this people. They will be killed by the sword or sent away as captives to all nations of the world. And Jerusalem will be trampled down by the Gentiles until the period of the Gentiles comes to an end. Now, Jesus went into quite a bit of detail in answering their question. First, he gave them the sign that signaled that Jerusalem, the temple, was about to be destroyed. Look at verse number 20 again. And when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then you will know that the time of its destruction has arrived. That's the sign that it's about to happen. Jerusalem would be surrounded by armies. And Jesus told his followers that when they saw this sign, they were to leave Jerusalem and Judea immediately and flee. Look at verse 21. Those in Jerusalem must get out, and those out in the country should not return to the city. Now let me ask you a question. Once the city was surrounded by armies, they were trapped. So how could they leave? Jesus said, when you see it surrounded by armies, get out of the city. But once it's surrounded by armies, you're trapped. Once they saw the sign, wasn't it too late to leave? Well, let me explain what happened. Because exactly what Jesus said came to pass. And it's always amazing to me how every little detail comes to pass. In 66 AD, the Jews revolted against the Romans. And the Roman general that was stationed in Israel at the time, Cestus Gallus, brought his army up from Caesarea and surrounded the city. When he surrounded the city, that was the sign that Jesus had promised. But here's what's interesting. A few days later, Cestus Gallus realized that his supply line was not secure. So he withdrew his army and he went back to Caesarea, which allowed thousands of Christians to flee the city. They saw all these armies surrounding the city and they said, that's the sign. But the next question is, how do we flee? And miraculously, about a week later, these armies pack up and they leave and go back to Caesarea. Now, Cestus Gallus was attacked and killed on his way back to Caesarea. A band of rebels attacked, they killed the general, and once he was killed, Rome sent another general by the name of Vespasian and his son Titus. In 68 AD, they besieged the city, and it fell in 70 AD. Altogether, over 1,100,000 Jews were killed in the final onslaught. If you count the ones that were killed during it, it was probably close to 1.5 million. Now, you'll have historians, archaeologists, you'll have different ones that will say, well, it couldn't have been that many. Jerusalem wasn't that big of a city. Well, what took place was when Vespasian and Titus came, it was Passover. Everyone from Israel had come. They surrounded the city with Passover. No one could leave. Here's what's interesting. Well, let me just say this. Anyone who survived was taken captive and they were sold into slavery. And exactly what Jesus said. All of these Jews were sold all over the world. But here's what's interesting. Supposedly, not one Jewish believer died because they obeyed the words of Jesus. When the city was surrounded, they waited for the opportunity to leave. About a week later, when Sistus Gallus left, they fled. And when Sistus Gallus was killed, most of them fled to the city of Pella. Yeah, and what today is modern-day Jordan. In Pella, they set up a Jewish synagogue, and they began teaching that Jesus was the Messiah. And they waited for the prophecy of Jesus to be fulfilled, which of course it was, down to the smallest detail. But their leaving created a huge rift between the Messianic Jews and the unbelieving Jews. You see, up until 70 AD, Jewish Christians were seen as a sect of Judaism. Now, they were still persecuted. People didn't speak well of the way, but they were looked on as a sect. If you remember when Paul's talking to some of the Romans, he's talking to them, well, we've heard about this. We've heard of the way. And we hear that people are talking against them. But they were still considered to be a sect of Judaism. But after the fall of Jerusalem and the destruction of the temple, the unbelieving Jews wanted to completely separate from the Jewish believers. And I'm going to talk about that for a second because most of us don't understand why, if the majority of the Christians in the early days after Jesus was resurrected, if the majority of Christians were Jewish, how in the world did that separate to the point now, if you're a Jewish believer, you're not considered to be a true Jew? How did that happen? Well, let me explain a few things. Once Vespasian surrounded the city, no one was allowed to go in or leave, unless, of course, they were surrendering. And the zealots who were in control of Jerusalem at the time, they weren't allowing anyone to surrender. If you were going to surrender, they'd just go ahead and put you to death. We're not going to allow you to be used as captives to build siege ramps against us. So if you want to surrender, well, we'll just kill you. And that's what they were doing. Well, there was an old influential rabbi by the name of Yohanan ben Zakkai. Let me say that again. Yohanan ben Zakkai. He was not a zealot. And he believed that the Romans would conquer the city and punish the Jews, possibly even destroying the temple. He had heard what the Jewish Christians had said before they left Jerusalem. Yeah. And his main concern was to make sure that Judaism survived, even if Israel as a nation didn't and the temple didn't. So he and his followers devised a plan. This is all historical fact. Some of his students went to the leaders in Jerusalem, and they told them that their great rabbi had died. And they asked permission to bury him outside the walls, which they received. So the rabbi was placed in a coffin and carried outside the city. Once they were within a Roman-occupied area, the rabbi rose out of his coffin, and he was taken to Vespasian. Vespasian knew of the old rabbi, and he knew he was very influential, and he thought, you know what? I might be able to use him to gain influence with some of the moderates, so he listened to his request. And he was shocked by the request, because all the rabbi wanted was permission to open a school in a little village called Yavne. So he and his followers were allowed to leave, and they set up a rabbinical school in Yavne. And the objective of the school was to develop a way to worship God without the temple. You see, what most of us don't realize is the Mosaic law centered around the temple. The sacrifices, the offerings, everything centered around the temple. So if the temple's destroyed, how in the world do we keep the Mosaic law without the temple? So Yohanan ben Zakkai and his followers, they went to Yavne, and what they did is they set up a rabbinical school, and their objective was to develop a way for them to be able to worship God without the temple. And that's really the birth of what we call today rabbinical Judaism. If you're reading a book today and you hear about rabbinical Judaism, most of you think back to the time of Jesus and you think, well, you know, rabbinical Judaism, they had rabbis. Jesus was a rabbi. And it's true. But that's not the term that scholars use for rabbinical Judaism. It simply means they had rabbis. Rabbinical Judaism wasn't established until after the temple was destroyed. And basically what rabbinical Judaism is, it's the belief that you can still serve God and keep the Mosaic law without the temple. So they had to develop a system in which they were seen to be faithful to God without the temple. But another objective of the school was to save Judaism by excommunicating all Jewish Christians from Judaism, because they saw Christianity as a threat. Number one, there was a lot of animosity because all of the Christians, when they saw the army surrounding Jerusalem, they split. They got out of Dodge. And not one of them died. But secondly, all of these Gentiles were accepting Jesus Christ as their Lord and Savior. And even worse, the leaders of this sect were telling them they didn't have to keep the Mosaic law. They didn't have to be circumcised. Didn't matter what they ate or drank. Yeah. And as a result of this, they thought the only way that we can save Judaism is if we can excommunicate these Christian Jews and separate them from Judaism. Yeah. So, they developed a benediction within the 18 benedictions that would identify Christians and enforce them out of the synagogue. You see, one of the things that they did to replace the temple, in the temple you started off the day with the sacrifices. You also did it in the middle of the day, and you also did it to end the day. Well, that's why Daniel and all of them prayed 3 times a day. You couldn't go to the temple, so what did you do? You prayed during those times. So rather than offer up sacrifices, you offered up the sacrifices of prayer. Well, they had 18 benedictions that they would offer up every morning and at noon and at the end of the day. So they developed a benediction within these 18 benedictions that would identify Christians and would force them out of the synagogue. This benediction is known as the Minim benediction. Minim is a generic term for heretic, but in that day it clearly referred to Jewish Christians. And if you were suspected of being a Christian and you came to the synagogue, they would force you during the prayer time to read the benedictions in the synagogue. And of course, Christian Jews had a problem with that. Yeah. They didn't have a problem with that until they got to the Birkat HaMinim, one of the benedictions that they'd added to it. It's known as the benediction of the heretic. Let me read it to you if you don't mind. Here's what it said.